Good morning and welcome to Monday. I am on one today and in a mood, and you might notice me unmasking more than I have in quite a while. Yes, a part of me is very loving and available, and a part of me is also incredibly sassy, and that is what today's video is going to target most, which is why I'm sassy based on a video or videos I post. I'm just so over people telling me when I spend hours researching and watching autistic creators and diving into things that, oh, everything you're posting that's not autism, that's just trauma. Why are you calling everyone autistic? First of all, Karen, everyone is not autistic. Second of all, to have autism is to have trauma, so that can make it difficult. And lastly, outside of a very limited population, and a very specific profile of autism, we are very, very far behind on understanding the vast flavor of autism as a neurotype, meaning that there are many variations, not just 31 flavors, about 1,000 flavors, especially around this part that I research, which is the female, has been called the female phenotype. Now we're in some places calling it the highly internalized type, because you might not be a female and have that type. And while we don't want to exclude anyone, we also need to do research on women and girls. So it's sort of a big conversation right now. But here are 5 things that are not trauma, so you can stop telling me in posts that they are. Now, is this 100% foolproof? No, because nothing in life is. But number 1, if you are a high-masking autistic individual, whether you are self-diagnosed or not, which is valid either way, it is not like the world is giving you resources that someone else didn't get because you identified. It is a way to make sense of who you are, to have compassion, to create accommodations, to take more control over your life and how you approach treatment, because as I've mentioned, and the research is showing that many women with a trauma history have been diagnosed as borderline when in fact they were autistic. And that's a problem when it comes to stigma and treatment and everything else in between. Okay? Number 1, sensory issues. If you have autism, you're not just going to have sensory issues around trauma-related events. For example, let's say that the person that harmed you, it happened in the mornings and they were making coffee every time, let's just say. And now as an adult, you feel repulsed at the smell of coffee. Why? Because it triggers your trauma. People with trauma and sensory issues are going to have sensory-specific trauma-related responses. People with autism are going to have a vast and wide and lifelong responsiveness and sensitivity to sensory issues, right? So when I say everything has bothered me, I mean everything. People's mouth sounds, the smell of things giving me a rage response, my clothing. These are going to be the kids that couldn't handle the tights, that had texture issues, where lighting was overstimulating. Now, you might have stronger reactions in one category of sensory issues, but you're going to have them by and large. That alone is not a trauma response. You don't have trauma and then have sensory issues to everything and everyone, okay? Number 2, special interest. I have yet to find any research on trauma that talks about people with trauma having special interests just in psychology, maybe self-healing, okay, fine, but not necessarily in science and art and literature and potentially mathematics, things like that, right? So there's a big difference. Also for us, our special interests help us focus on our lives. They can be very healing. They're an important part of what makes us who we are. For example, if you look at my channel here with over 500 videos just on YouTube alone, you're going to find a pretty limited area of passion. My expertise exists because I have had a passion in understanding for years borderline parents, narcissistic parents, trauma, childhood wounds, self-abandonment. And then I discovered understanding autism, and I have been talking about that ever since. You will not find me answering 5,000 questions on 5,000 psychology topics because I'm not an expert in those things. It would be unethical and it wouldn't really be authentic. I've even made videos, if you look back a while, it was, I think, one of my first videos on understanding autism before I realized what was going on with myself. And someone said in the comments, this, I can't remember what they said, like, this feels sort of clinical. And they weren't wrong. If you notice, I didn't notice that at the time. I was just giving the information I discovered. But as I became passionate about this topic, I think you could argue easily that it's evident in how I share and how I talk about it. Number 4, camouflaging. Now, as a traumatized person, you might try to create or sculpt a version of yourself in a reactive way to overcome the shame of your childhood, for example. Here's one. I grew up in an apartment with a very embarrassing, at times chaotic mother. I was ashamed about that a lot, and all I ever wanted was to have this like perfect family, right? I grew up on Leave It to Beaver and all these shows, Happy Days. And so when I got married, of course, I wanted like my house to look perfect. Yeah. Okay, fine. That could be a trauma response. But when you dive deeper, you look at, ever since I was little, I'd have to have 1 or 2 pairs of shoes or this one pair of jeans that everyone else was wearing to fit in. I would have massive social communication issues, saying the wrong thing, getting in trouble for it, for just saying something that, to adults that I didn't think there was anything wrong with. And so all of that is an attempt to fit in. There are these core patterns that are making us mask and camouflage. And for high maskers, we've been doing it so much our whole life that even trying to tease out an autism diagnosis can be challenging. Many of you have gone on Embrace Autism and filled out the questions, and even the way we literally answer them or the way we think we should answer them, even in assessments, can be a challenge. And so a challenge meaning that we're so used to doing what we're supposed to do and giving the answer. You're not going to see that in trauma. In trauma, you're going to have shame. In autism, you can have shame, most certainly. But the roots of how we respond to that are going to be reactive in response to what the trauma triggered in us versus my whole life is about trying to find ways to be like everyone else. Number 4. Routine and repetition can often be incredibly important for autistic people. And sure, I'm sure that if you had a traumatic childhood and you have no autism, trying to have order and structure in your life is probably a good thing. But the way the autistic brain works, these patterns of repetition and routine serve a purpose. The routine reduces our need to figure everything out and assess it and analyze it. It creates a comfort and predictability and a way of mastering the world and feeling in control. And repetition, and even now some research talks about women engaging in rumination, that internal replaying something as a way of being repetitive. So yeah, can you ruminate in trauma? Of course you can. Can you have social anxiety and anxiety? Of course you can. But the way it shows up and the root of it is quite different. Difficulty reading cues. There's no reason why a traumatized slow down. There's no reason why a traumatized person would suddenly have a difficult time knowing what to say or do in situations. So these are different. Number 5, isolating. Of course, if you're traumatized, and I talk about this so much that I think this applies to traumatized people, and autistic people, that being alone may be the only time we feel truly safe in our bodies. We don't have to read anybody else or worry about them. We don't have to be hypervigilant. And I'm going to keep saying it forever, which is I believe that hypervigilance is a huge crossover piece. And the way it manifests might look a little different. But because if you have autism, it is to be also traumatized. It is almost impossible to find an autistic person without trauma. You're going to see overlap. But just because you don't understand that doesn't mean that me making a video about, hey, this might be autism, is me trying to make everyone autistic. Okay, my whole thing is to continue to share my own journey and what I'm learning to help you, because it changes everything from diagnosis and treatment and self-compassion, and really the way you go about the world. So for people with autism also, though we can have a higher level of loneliness, we can also really, not everyone, but love being alone. Loving being alone can be reparative and a place to dive into our special interests, to stim without judgment. There's going to be layers of this that are different than I isolate in reactivity to feeling rejected by the world. You can feel that if you're autistic and traumatized, but the way that we move about the world and being alone for autistic people is most likely going to also be tapping into a part of our brains that finds it incredibly restorative in a way that allows us to be our authentic selves and not so much about no one cares for me and I'm just going to be alone and untriggered, if that makes sense. So those are really important to me. And I just, woke up today. I have so much to do today. I'm super motivated. But I also wanted to just share this because it's so frustrating to have people act like because you're educating about a neurotype that guess what, we don't know anything about mostly because all of the research has been limited to this one particular population. And frankly, it doesn't even do justice to that population because it only identifies a certain neurotypical profile. And this is also true for girls. The girls who were mostly diagnosed with autism under the current diagnostic criteria were those who usually had some form of intellectual impairment or impairment and or their presentation was a more, this isn't the right word, but it is based on the boys that had autism, a more masculine version, more rigid, not empathic, things like that. And we know now that there can be other profiles, though the empathy might look different in how it's doled out and how we experience it and who gets it, that, for example, it was easily believed that autistic people were not empathic. When it turns out that as one of these profiles, like the female phenotype, we have been trained our whole lives to please others, to be needless and nurturing. So if we're camouflaging to fit in with that, it's going to make sense that it might look like that and might make it very difficult for us to get what we need, which is understanding, support, self-love, compassion. It has changed everything. I don't need to make excuses for wearing the same sweatshirt and the same 4 different colors. I don't need to, now that my new vibe is sweatpants, when I had a friend, a best friend, the one from the chicken story, if you ever watched that video, who had never worn sweatpants in her entire life. And I had always been someone who was like, up until I got, kind of older, when I, and I'll still do this, you'll see me make videos on TikTok and other places not wearing makeup. I do it here, I think, because of the way YouTube is organized. But my point is, I would go to everywhere in sweatpants. I'm not to a nice restaurant. But the thing is, I thought, am I doing that wrong? Maybe I am being trashy for doing that. This person had never worn sweatpants to the grocery store, okay? And we're not friends anymore. But the point is, when I heard that for a lot of years, I thought, that's a sign of not being classy or something. I don't know. I'm just saying that when you have an autistic brain, you take things literally in ways that are often harmful. And that is why I am here. And because I love talking about trauma and about autism, I'm going to keep doing that. And I hope you will join me. So thanks for being here. Have a beautiful day. And I will see you hopefully tomorrow. Take good care.